Katarzyna, a 30-year-old woman, could never imagine how her life would change the moment she gave birth to triplets. Her marriage to Marcin, which until then seemed solid and full of love, fell apart as soon as the babies were born. Upon seeing that the children were black, Marcin was in shock, unable to deal with the situation. He didn't want to hear explanations, he didn't want to try to understand what had happened. The same night the babies were born, he packed his bags and walked out the door, leaving Katarzyna to her fate. With a broken heart and triplets in her arms, Katarzyna saw her life crumble before her eyes. She was alone, without a husband and without the emotional support of Marcin, who had disappeared without a trace. The society they lived in was not kind to her either. Many questioned how a white woman could have given birth to black children, and rumors about cheating quickly began to circulate around the small town where they lived. Katarzyna tried to stay strong, but social pressure and lack of support made her feel the weight of loneliness. Even with Marcin's abandonment and the judgmental looks of the community, Katarzyna decided that she would do everything possible and impossible to raise her children with love and dignity. She didn't know the biological reason behind the birth of triplets with characteristics so different from hers, but she knew that she loved those little ones more than anything else in the world. Maternal instinct was what moved her, and she clung to it with all her strength. As time went by, she learned to face the challenges, even without answers about what had happened. In the first few months, life was difficult. Without Marcin's financial support, Katarzyna had to look for new means of support. She got a part-time job at a local store while taking care of the babies. With every suspicious look she received, with every nasty comment, she raised her head with pride. His children, Julia, David and Stefan, were his joy. They were healthy, laughing, and, as time passed, they began to grow and develop their distinct personalities. Katarzyna knew that she loved them unconditionally, regardless of any differences others might point out. The children grew up surrounded by love, but the weight of unanswered questions always hung over the house. Katarzyna tried for years to understand what had happened, looking for medical explanations or traces of Marcin, but everything seemed like a big mystery. The triplets began to question their own identity, as it was impossible not to notice the differences between them and their mother. Katarzyna, despite her doubts, always reaffirmed her unconditional love. "You're mine and that's what matters," she often said. Over time, the pain of abandonment was replaced by a life dedicated to children. But, although the routine had stabilized, Marcin's absence and the lack of an explanation for the birth of her children continued to haunt Katarzyna. She wondered what had happened for her husband to abandon her like that and what had led her children to be born with characteristics so different from hers. The truth, however, seemed increasingly distant and inaccessible. Years passed and life took its course. Katarzyna became an even stronger and more resilient mother, and the triplets, now 6 years old, filled her home with joy and chaos. However, on a quiet Sunday morning, something unexpected happened. A knock on the door interrupted the peace of the house. Upon opening the door, Katarzyna was faced with a face she hadn't seen in years. Marcin was back, and his words would not only surprise her, but would change the course of their lives forever. The shock of seeing Marcin at the door left Katarzyna unresponsive for a few moments. The figure of the man who had once been her husband was there, standing before her, as if the last few years of silence and abandonment had never existed. Marcin was visibly different, thinner, his face marked by time, but his eyes still carried something familiar. Katarzyna tried to process what was happening, but before she could ask him anything, he spoke. "We need to talk, Katarzyna. There's a lot you don't know." The sound of his voice brought back a flood of emotions. Anger, pain, confusion. For years, she had imagined what she would say if she saw him again. But now that he was here, no words seemed enough to express the whirlwind of feelings that were rising within her. Katarzyna took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment, but decided that he deserved to be heard, even if the hurt was still fresh in her heart. She invited him in, knowing that this conversation would reveal long-hidden truths. The triplets played in the next room, oblivious to the tense reunion taking place in the kitchen. Marcin looked at his children, now grown up, and for a moment he seemed to get emotional. "They look beautiful," he murmured, almost voicelessly, as his gaze followed them. But Katarzyna didn't want any distractions. "You left them," she said, with coldness in her voice. "I haven't had anything to do with them since the day they were born. Now, after all these years, you show up. Why?" Marcin lowered his head, as if gathering the strength to respond. He began to tell a story that Katarzyna could never have predicted. In the days after the triplets were born, Marcin had engaged in a series of personal investigations into his own origins. Something in his family that he had never known could explain what had happened to his children. He walked away, he said, not out of rejection, but because he needed to understand something his family had kept secret for generations. "I discovered that my grandmother, who we never spoke about, was descended from an African lineage. Her blood runs through me and, consequently, through our children." Katarzyna looked at him in disbelief. I didn't know whether to believe that explanation, whether to feel relief or even more confusion. "And why didn't you tell me anything? Why did you disappear?" The pain in his voice was palpable.
Marcin hesitated, visibly embarrassed.
"I didn't know how to deal with it. I was scared. I felt ashamed, Katarzyna, and I was a coward. I thought that by running away, I would find answers, but what I found was more pain and regret." Katarzyna felt his words, but the weight of the years of abandonment was still there, a wound that did not heal easily. Although Marcin's revelation was unexpected, Katarzyna didn't know if she was ready to forgive him. He had disappeared at the moment she needed him most. The triplets grew up without their father, and that was a difficult reality to accept. However, the answers he brought shed light on the mystery that had accompanied her for so long. Now, she was faced with a choice. Confront the past with Marcin or continue the life she built alone with her children. Marcin asked to see his children, and Katarzyna, with a divided heart, allowed him to enter the room. The triplets, curious about the man who was watching them with such intense eyes, approached him without understanding the depth of that moment. "Hi," said Julia, the more extroverted one, looking directly at Marcin. He smiled, a sad, regretful smile.
Erraplia, Axita.
I'm your father." After Marcin's unexpected revelation, the atmosphere in Katarzyna's house became tense and filled with uncertainty. The triplets, still too young to understand the complexity of the situation, reacted with curiosity to Marcin's presence. They had never met their father, and now, suddenly, this stranger was there, introducing himself as such. Although Katarzyna allowed him to see them, distrust was still in her heart. The years of silence could not be easily erased, and Marcin's presence reopened deep wounds that she had learned to deal with. In the days that followed, Marcin insisted on trying to reconnect with his children. He appeared more often, bringing gifts and trying to establish a bond with the children. Katarzyna watched from afar, hesitantly. She wanted the best for the triplets, and knew that having a father in their lives could be a positive thing. Yet each visit from Marcin was a reminder of the past, of the lonely nights when she struggled to raise them alone, without any support. The triplets, in turn, began to gradually accept Marcin. Julia, the most open and curious, was the first to truly get close to him. She asked direct questions, the kind only a child can ask. "Why did you leave? Why didn't you come back sooner?" Marcin, visibly shaken by these questions, tried to answer as honestly as he could. He explained that it was a mistake, that he was trying to make peace, but he knew that words wouldn't be enough to erase the years of absence. David and Stefan, more reserved, watched from afar. Although they didn't express as much as Julia, it was clear that they were processing the situation in their own way. David, always the most introspective, seemed distant in his interactions with Marcin. Stefan, on the other hand, showed signs of anger, as if he didn't want to accept the presence of someone who abandoned them. Katarzyna knew that her children needed time to understand what was happening, and that the acceptance process would be complicated and full of ups and downs. Marcin, determined to regain his children's respect and love, began to visit Katarzyna's house more. He tried to participate in the children's routine, helping with their schoolwork and taking them out for walks. Katarzyna, despite all the resentment she still felt, couldn't ignore the fact that Marcin was making a genuine effort to be present. She knew that, deep down, it was important for the triplets to have a relationship with their father, but that didn't lessen the pain she felt when she saw Marcin trying to reintegrate himself into their lives. One day, Marcin asked to have a serious talk with Katarzyna. He knew that for any reconciliation with his children to be true, he would need to resolve the outstanding issues between them. "I know I hurt you," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "I was wrong to leave our children. I don't know if you will ever be able to forgive me, but I am willing to try to rebuild what I destroyed. I don't expect things to go back to the way they were before, but I want you to know that I am here, and I won't run away again." Marcin's words moved Katarzyna. She spent years building an emotional fortress, protecting herself from the pain that abandonment brought. Now, with Marcin asking for a second chance, she found herself faced with a dilemma. Would it be possible to forgive him? Did she still love him in some way? These questions tormented her as she struggled to balance her desire to protect her children with the possibility of offering them the chance to have a father there. The conversation ended without definitive answers. Marcin knew that the road to forgiveness would be long and full of obstacles. For Katarzyna, the biggest challenge would be letting go of resentment and making space for the possibility of a new family dynamic. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Marcin's return had changed everything, and Katarzyna and the triplets' lives would never be the same. The days following her conversation with Marcin were an emotional roller coaster for Katarzyna. While he struggled to reconnect with the triplets, she continued to struggle with her own feelings. The hurt and resentment were deeply rooted in her, and Marcin's effort to return to her children's lives, although genuine, did not erase the years of absence. Still, something inside her, a silent, persistent voice, said that maybe it was time to give him a second chance. The children, in turn, began to slowly adapt to their father's presence. Julia was the most open to the relationship, curious and willing to get to know Marcin as he was now. David and Stefan, however, remained further apart. Stefan, especially, struggled with feelings of anger and confusion. For him, the figure of Marcin was someone who had abandoned them, and now suddenly expected to be accepted back. Katarzyna, worried about how this would affect her children, knew she would need to be delicate in how she handled the reconciliation process. One night, while the children slept, Katarzyna sat alone in the living room, reflecting on the past few months. His life, which was already complex, seemed to be entering a new phase of uncertainty. Marcin's return, while opening up the possibility of healing for her children, also brought to light wounds that she believed she had already overcome. She still felt a deep pain remembering the day he walked out the door without explanation, and the idea that he could do it again haunted her. Katarzyna talked to a trusted friend about the dilemma she was experiencing. She explained how Marcin's return left her torn between her desire to protect her children and her desire to provide them with a complete family. "You don't have to forgive him right away," said the friend. "But perhaps giving him a chance to be the father his children deserve is something you should consider. It doesn't mean what he did was acceptable, but it might be a way for all of you to move forward." That conversation stayed in Katarzyna's mind. Her friend's advice seemed sensible, but forgiveness was complicated. For her, it wasn't just about forgetting what happened, but about accepting the possibility that Marcin could have changed. Over the years, she had learned to be a strong, independent mother, and she didn't want to jeopardize the emotional stability she had built for the triplets. Still, there was a part of her that wondered if, by denying the chance for reconciliation, she was depriving her children of something important. Finally, Katarzyna decided she needed more time to observe how Marcin interacted with the triplets. She knew she could not make a hasty decision, nor give in to the desire to protect her children at any cost. They, after all, had the right to know their father and form their own opinions. She, in turn, needed to find a way to deal with her own feelings before making any definitive decisions about their future as a family. With that thought in mind, she began allowing Marcin to spend more time with the children. He took them for walks in the park, helped them with their homework, and, little by little, he gained their trust. But even with these moments of reconnection, Katarzyna knew that forgiveness would be a long, painful process. For her, for Marcin, and especially for the triplets. The path ahead was uncertain, but it was clear that the decisions he made in the coming months would be crucial to his family's future. As time passed, Marcin's presence in the triplets' lives began to influence the children's behavior in different ways. Julia, always open and communicative, seemed to be getting closer to her father. She asked him questions about his childhood, what he liked to do, and even talked enthusiastically about school. It was clear that she had a natural curiosity about the man who had come back into their lives, and although there was still a subtle distance, she was willing to try. David, on the other hand, was more hesitant. He was introspective, and although he didn't object to Marcin's presence, he also didn't make an effort to create a bond with his father. Katarzyna noticed that David spent a lot of time silently observing the interactions between Marcin and his brothers, but he rarely got involved. She knew this was a reflection of his personality, but she was also worried that he was internalizing his feelings, unable to process everything that was happening. Stefan, however, was the one struggling the most with the situation. He was openly hostile towards Marcin, rejecting attempts to get closer and showing signs of repressed anger. Katarzyna knew that Stefan's behavior was a result of the abandonment he felt since he was little. He, more than the others, seemed to have developed a negative view of Marcin, and his father's sudden presence in his life only increased this frustration. "Why is he back now after so long?" Stefan asked his mother, always with a bitter tone. Katarzyna tried hard to comfort her children, explaining that Marcin's return was an attempt to right the wrongs of the past. But she knew that wouldn't be enough for Stefan. He needed more time and, perhaps, a deeper conversation with his father. But Stefan, until that moment, refused to give any opening to this dialogue. The pain of abandonment was a wound he carried, and Katarzyna feared that if not treated properly, it could leave permanent emotional scars. One night, while she was in the kitchen preparing dinner, Katarzyna heard the triplets talking to each other in the living room. They didn't know she was listening, and what Stefan said surprised her. "I don't trust him," he said, his voice full of resentment. "He can leave again like he did before, and this time I won't wait." Katarzyna felt her heart sink. Seeing her son so hurt and suspicious put her in a difficult position. She wanted to believe that Marcin was truly trying to redeem himself, but she knew she would need to do more to earn Stefan's trust back. Faced with this situation, Katarzyna decided it would be best to seek professional help. She knew that the triplets were dealing with complex emotions and that she alone might not have the right tools to help them process it all. He spoke with Marcin about the possibility of taking his children to a child therapist. Surprisingly, he immediately agreed. "I will do whatever is necessary to help you," he said sincerely. "If that's what's best for them, then that's what we should do." With Marcin's support, Katarzyna looked for a specialist who could help the children understand their feelings and deal with their father's return. Although she knew the process would be long and challenging, Katarzyna was determined to give the triplets all the tools they needed to overcome the emotional scars that abandonment had caused. She knew the journey would be difficult, but she believed that with time and the right support, the triplets would find a way to heal these wounds and move forward. The therapy process with the triplets started slowly, but soon showed promising results. The child therapist, an experienced and sensitive woman, knew how to create a safe environment for children to express their feelings. The first few sessions were more observational, where Julia, David, and Stefan drew and played while the therapist carefully guided them in subtle conversations about their emotions. Stefan, predictably, was the most resistant, but he slowly began to open up, albeit defensively. In the first sessions, the therapist observed that the children had very different reactions to Marcin's abandonment. Julia, with her positive nature, was processing her father's return as a second chance. David, as always, kept his feelings in check, although it was clear he was struggling internally to understand his own position in relation to his father. Stefan, in turn, carried the most visible weight. His anger and distrust permeated his interactions with Marcin, and he seemed to have developed a self-protection mechanism to avoid future disappointments. Katarzyna, present in some sessions, was also an important part of the therapeutic process. She knew that in order for her children to heal, she would also need to deal with her own scars. The therapist encouraged Katarzyna to talk about her own emotions surrounding Marcin's abandonment, and although it was difficult, she eventually began to release some of the pain she carried. Talking openly about how betrayed and alone she felt was a liberating, albeit painful, experience. During one of the most intense sessions, Stefan finally expressed the anger he had held in for so long. He left us, and now he thinks he can come back and be our father as if nothing ever happened, Stefan shouted, tears finally breaking through the barrier he had erected. Marcin, who was present at that session, was taken by surprise, but remained firm. You're right, Stefan. I made a terrible mistake. I ran away when I shouldn't have. But I'm here now, and I want to try to be the father you deserve. It was the first time Stefan seemed to consider Marcin's sincerity. Although there was no immediate forgiveness, something changed at that moment. Katarzyna, observing the interaction between the two, realized that the healing journey would be long, but possible. She also knew that Marcin would have to prove, with actions and not just words, that he was committed to being a constant presence in the triplets' lives. Stefan ultimately agreed to give his father a chance, but made it clear that he still didn't fully trust him. Therapy sessions continued over the months, and little by little the children began to show signs of progress. Julia, always optimistic, was more confident in her relationship with her father. David, in his introspective way, began to talk more openly about his feelings, something that surprised even Katarzyna. And Stefan, although still hesitant, showed that he was willing to try, as long as Marcin kept his promise not to abandon them again. Marcin, in turn, made a visible effort to be the present father he never was before. He became involved in school activities, began attending the children's important events, and spent more time with them at home. It wasn't easy. He still faced resistance, mainly from Stefan, but every day there seemed to be a small victory. For Katarzyna, seeing her children begin to open up and trust again was a sign of hope that the family, despite everything, could find its way. The healing process, although slow, was underway. The therapist had been instrumental in guiding the family toward reconciliation and forgiveness. Katarzyna, who had once feared that Marcin's return would cause more harm than good, was now beginning to believe that, perhaps, this second chance was what everyone needed to finally move on. There were still challenges ahead, but for the first time in years, she felt like there was a light at the end of the tunnel, and that, together, they could find the peace and happiness they had been searching for. Over time, Marcin's visits began to become a natural part of Katarzyna and the triplets' routine. He was no longer a sporadic visitor, but a constant presence in the children's lives, and, little by little, the family dynamics began to change. The children, each in their own way, began to adapt to the idea of having their father around again. However, this new routine brought with it new challenges for Katarzyna, who was still getting used to the idea of sharing parental responsibility with Marcin. Julia continued to be the most receptive daughter. She enjoyed spending time with Marcin, especially in activities that involved games and outdoor play. Seeing her father so involved in her life gave her a sense of security that she had never experienced before. She started telling more stories about school, talking about her friends and even planning family outings, something that previously seemed impossible. Julia's openness came as a relief to Katarzyna, who had always feared that the triplets would not have a father figure. David, in turn, still maintained a certain emotional distance. He participated in activities and fulfilled his obligations, but avoided deep interactions with Marcin. Katarzyna understood that David needed more time. He was introspective by nature and processed everything slowly and carefully. Unlike Julia, who threw herself headlong into new experiences, David observed and reflected before giving himself up completely. Marcin, aware of this, also showed patience. He knew that regaining David's trust would take time, but he was willing to follow that path. Stefan, the most resistant to his father's presence, began to show small signs of progress. Although he still carried an obvious emotional weight, he participated in conversations with Marcin and sometimes even accepted his invitations to activities together. Katarzyna knew that Stefan still had reservations, but the mere fact that he allowed Marcin to get close was a big step. The therapist had warned that Stefan would be the most difficult to win over, But with persistence and sincerity, Marcin was slowly gaining space in his son's heart. Despite these advances, Katarzyna still faced her own internal dilemmas. Marcin's constant presence left her torn between her desire to create a family environment for the triplets and the feelings of betrayal and hurt she carried. There were days when she found herself smiling when she saw him interacting with the children, and others when anger from the past resurfaced, reminding her of moments of abandonment and loneliness. She knew she would need to find a way to balance these feelings if she wanted the new family dynamic to work. One night, Marcin called her for a talk. "I know there is still a lot of pain between us," he began, his tone serious. "I don't expect you to forgive me quickly, but I wanted to know how you're dealing with all of this. I'm here for the triplets, but I also want to know how you feel." Katarzyna was surprised by his openness. For so long, she kept these feelings to herself, not knowing if Marcin really cared. But there, in front of him, he realized it was time to start talking about his own pain. Katarzyna admitted she was still struggling to forgive him. "You left me at the worst time of my life," she said, her voice low but firm. "I've had to be strong on my own for so long, and now you show up like you want to make amends for all of that. I don't know if I'm ready for this." Marcin listened in silence, respecting his words. He knew the journey would be long and complicated, but he was determined to do whatever it took to rebuild the trust he destroyed years before. After the frank conversation with Marcin, Katarzyna felt that something inside her began to move. It was as if, by finally verbalizing the pain she carried, she had taken a step towards healing. However, the path to forgiveness would not be simple. Memories of the past still haunted her, and there was a part of her that couldn't let go of the fear that Marcin might hurt them again. To move forward, she knew she would need to confront these memories once and for all. One afternoon, while cleaning the attic of the house, Katarzyna found an old box full of photos and objects from the time she and Marcin were together. The wedding, the trips, and even the first photos from when she became pregnant with the triplets were there, like witnesses to a life that seemed to belong to someone else. As she held those photos in her hands, she felt a mixture of nostalgia and sadness. Everything they had built, everything she believed would be eternal, had been crumbled in an instant with Marcin's abandonment. She spent hours looking at the photos and reliving those moments, trying to understand where everything went wrong. Did Marcin always have doubts about the life they were building? Or was the shock of the triplets' birth really what drove him away? Katarzyna didn't have those answers, but she knew that in order to move forward, she would need to confront her own feelings about the past. She decided it was time to sit down with Marcin and talk about what they had both avoided for so long. The moment he left her. The next day, Katarzyna asked Marcin to come to her house after the children were asleep. She wanted an uninterrupted conversation where they could talk openly about what happened. When he arrived, Katarzyna wasted no time and got straight to the point. "I found the photos from our past," she said, placing the box on the table. "Everything we built, everything we imagined together. I need to know why you thought you could just leave it all behind." Marcin, visibly uncomfortable, took a deep breath before responding. "At that moment I was so scared, Katarzyna. I know it's not an excuse, but it was like everything I knew was turned upside down. When I saw the triplets, when I realized they were different, I went into overdrive. Panic. I didn't know how to deal with it, and instead of staying and fighting for what we had, I ran away." He looked at the photos on the table, the memories of a life he had destroyed with his absence. Katarzyna felt a lump in her throat. What Marcin said was something she expected to hear, but hearing the truth still hurt. "You left me alone," she repeated, her voice shaking. "I had to be strong for them, I had to be everything they needed, while you were missing. Now, you come back as if you hope all will be forgiven. But it's not that simple." Tears began to roll down Katarzyna's face, and Marcin, with a heavy heart, watched her in silence. "I know I can't change the past," he said after a long silence, "but I can try to be better in the present, for you and for our children. I know I made a mistake, and I know the road to forgiveness will be long. I don't expect everything to go back to the way it was, but I'm here now, and I'll stay. I won't run away again." Marcin stood up and cautiously placed his hand over Katarzyna's. She didn't back down, but she didn't return the gesture either. After that conversation, something changed between them. Katarzyna knew that forgiveness would not come quickly, but for the first time, she felt that perhaps there was a possibility of healing. The reconciliation process, however, would be slow, and she would need more time to fully trust Marcin again. The wounds from the past were still there, but now, with his return and his continued presence in the triplets' lives, she began to believe that, with time, the scars might begin to heal. Little by little, the relationship between Katarzyna and Marcin began to stabilize. Although complete forgiveness was still a long way off, she realized she was beginning to let her guard down. Seeing Marcin try so hard to reconnect with his children, especially Stefan, showed that he was committed to making amends for past mistakes. For Katarzyna, this change in attitude was crucial so that she could eventually think about a deeper reconciliation. One afternoon, Katarzyna was surprised by a gesture from Marcin. He had planned a short trip with the triplets to a nearby city where they could explore museums and parks. The invitation wasn't just for his children, he also included her. "I know this might seem like a big step, but I thought it would be nice to spend time together as a family," he said, his tone hesitant. Katarzyna didn't expect it, but the invitation touched her in an unexpected way. It was the first time he had suggested doing something with everyone as a family unit. She thought for a moment and, with a mixture of curiosity and trepidation, accepted the invitation. The trip, although short, felt like an important step in rebuilding what they had lost. Julia, David and Stefan were excited about the idea, especially Julia, who loved the idea of going outdoors with her family. For Katarzyna, this would be a test, an opportunity to see if Marcin's presence in their lives could really work in the long term. During the trip, the children had fun exploring new places and doing outdoor activities. Julia and Marcin seemed more connected than ever, laughing together and sharing moments of complicity. David, still observant, participated in the activities, but continued to maintain his emotional distance. Stefan, to Katarzyna's surprise, seemed more at ease than usual. He was opening up, although still cautiously, and Marcin respected his pace, without forcing approaches. One night during the trip, Katarzyna and Marcin were alone for a brief moment while the children slept. They were sitting on the hotel terrace, looking at the starry sky. "I know we still have a lot to resolve," Marcin said, breaking the silence, "but this trip made me realize how much I missed by being away from you. I'll never be able to make up for lost time, but I'm ready to try and build something new." Katarzyna was silent, reflecting on her words. She knew that the past could not be erased, but perhaps with time, it would be possible to build a new future. Katarzyna finally looked at Marcin and, for the first time in years, smiled genuinely. "I see that you're trying, and that's important to me," she said. "I don't know if I'm ready to forget everything that happened, but I'm willing to keep trying, for the sake of the triplets and maybe for us too." These words, although cautious, were an important step in the journey of reconciliation. Marcin smiled, feeling that, for the first time, there was a real openness to forgiveness. The trip ended on a positive note. The children returned home happy, and the atmosphere in Katarzyna's house was lighter. Although the road to healing was still long, Katarzyna and Marcin began to plant the first seeds of forgiveness. There was a mutual understanding that it would be a gradual process, but both were willing to continue moving in that direction. For Katarzyna, the most important thing was that her children were seeing their father's effort to be part of their lives. For Marcin, it was the hope that one day he could finally redeem himself. Months have passed since the family trip, and, little by little, the relationship between Marcin, Katarzyna, and the triplets began to transform into something more solid. Trust, which previously seemed like a distant dream, was now being built, brick by brick, through small gestures and Marcin's constant presence in the children's lives. Although the path was still full of ups and downs, the family dynamic began to take shape, with Katarzyna allowing Marcin to take a more active role in raising the children. Julia, who had always been the most open to reconciliation, was increasingly closer to Marcin. The two shared a complicit relationship, and she completely trusted her father. Stefan, who previously showed so much resistance, finally showed signs of a significant change. Although he was still reserved, he began to trust Marcin more, accepting that despite his past mistakes, his father was truly committed to being a part of his life. The forgiveness process was long and painful for Stefan, but he knew that, in order to move forward, he needed to let go of some of his anger. David, the most introspective of the three, also began to change. Although he maintained his more reserved posture, he felt more comfortable next to Marcin. Conversations that were previously scarce now began to flow more naturally. David was a boy who processed everything silently, and for him, rebuilding his relationship with his father was a process that occurred little by little, without much demonstration, but with small signs of acceptance. Katarzyna, in turn, continued to deal with her own feelings. Although Marcin was proving to be a more present and attentive father, she knew that the emotional wounds he carried would not disappear overnight. However, she noticed that over the months, the anger she felt was subsiding. Her love for her children had always been her priority, and seeing how they were reconnecting with their father made her reconsider her own feelings. Maybe forgiveness, after all, wasn't as impossible as she imagined. On a quiet night, while the children slept, Katarzyna and Marcin found themselves sitting on the porch of her house again, as they had done after the trip. The silence between them was no longer uncomfortable, but rather a reflection of everything they had overcome. Marcin looked at Katarzyna and, for the first time since returning, he felt like he could speak honestly about the future. "I know we can't erase what happened," he said, his voice soft, "but I'm ready to move on, to build something new. And I want you to know that even if it takes me a while, I'll keep trying to earn your trust back." Katarzyna watched him for a moment, reflecting on everything that had happened. The path to reconciliation was not easy, but Marcin's effort was undeniable. She knew that over the years they had transformed, and that although the marriage had broken down, a new form of relationship was emerging. One that could benefit not just the triplets, but both of them as well. "I don't know if I'm ready to forgive completely," Katarzyna admitted honestly. "But I know we can move forward, for ourselves and for our children." Those words marked a new chapter for both of them. Complete forgiveness would still take time, but the path was being walked with patience and commitment. Katarzyna knew that the love she had felt for Marcin in the past had changed, but that didn't mean they couldn't create something new, something based on respect and the experiences they shared. They were no longer the same people they were before, but that also meant they had the chance to start over in a more mature and conscious way. The triplets, now 7 years old, were the center of this new beginning. With the support of both Katarzyna and Marcin, they grew up in an environment of love and security. The abandonment that once marked them was slowly being replaced by happy moments and a feeling of family, although different from the conventional one. Katarzyna knew that, despite the difficulties, she and Marcin were managing to provide their children with a solid foundation so they could grow up with confidence and love. As Katarzyna looked to the future, she felt hope. Although the healing journey was not yet complete, what had begun as a story of pain and abandonment was now transforming into a story of forgiveness, resilience, and renewal. Marcin's return brought with it many challenges, but it also opened the door to a new possibility of happiness. And together, with patience and determination, they were ready to build this new life. A life marked not only by the past, but by the strength of what they could create in the future, as a family that learned to heal itself.